Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Tucked between rolling hills and quiet lakes, it was the sort of place where neighbors waved at each other from porches, where the old diner's neon sign glowed late into the night, and where children rode their bikes down streets without fear. That sense of safety shattered the night 4-year-old Jacob Miller disappeared. It began like any other evening. Parents called their kids in from the park as the sun melted behind the trees. But when Jacob's mother came looking, his swing was empty, swaying in the cool evening breeze. The boy's shoes were left by the sandbox, but Jacob was nowhere to be found. Panic spread quickly. Parents grabbed flashlights, volunteers rushed into the woods, and police combed the area. Hours turned to days, and days turned to weeks. Cedar Falls, once peaceful, was now a town living under the shadow of dread. Rumors sprouted like weeds. Some blamed strangers passing through, others whispered about troubled neighbors, and a few even suspected people they had once trusted. The police launched a wide investigation, but leads fizzled out. Evidence was scarce, and without a witness, the case began to stall. Then, months later, an arrest was made. A man in his 30s, Raymond Clark, became the prime suspect. He lived only a few blocks from the park, had a history of suspicious behavior, and witnesses recalled seeing him walking late that night. When detectives searched his home, they found inconsistencies, scratches on his arms, muddy clothing, and stories that shifted under questioning. Though there was no body, the prosecution pressed forward. By the time the case reached the courthouse, Cedar Falls had split in two. Half believed Clark was guilty. The other half believed the police were desperate, pinning blame on a man they already distrusted. The trial became the town's obsession. Reporters from bigger cities filled the benches. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. And every day, people argued in grocery stores and barbershops about what really happened. But as the prosecution built its case, doubts lingered. The physical evidence was thin. Witnesses were inconsistent. Without something more, conviction seemed far away. The defense attorney confidently declared his client would walk free. And in truth, he might have if not for a name that suddenly appeared in the prosecutor's notes. Emily Turner. Emily was only 3 years old. She lived in the same neighborhood. Her family often visited the park, and she had been there the night Jacob vanished. At first, no one thought to ask a toddler. How could a child so young possibly remember details clearly, let alone testify? But Emily had startled her mother one night, waking from a dream and whispering. The man with the shoes took the boy. Her words, innocent yet chilling, reached the ears of investigators. The prosecutor hesitated. Calling a toddler to the stand was risky. Juries distrusted very young children. Defense attorneys tore their words apart. Judges rarely approved it. But desperation breeds courage. The prosecution had almost nothing else. And if Emily had truly seen something, her voice might tip the balance. The defense scoffed when they learned. "You're basing your case on a baby?" Clark's attorneys sneered. "She can't even say the alphabet, and you want her to solve a crime?" Many agreed. Reporters mocked the decision in hushed tones. Even the judge, a seasoned man who had seen hundreds of trials, furrowed his brow in doubt. Still, permission was granted. Emily Turner would take the stand. The day she was scheduled to appear, the courthouse felt different. The air was heavier, as though everyone knew something unpredictable was about to happen. The usual chatter in the gallery was muted. Reporters sharpened pencils, ready to scribble headlines. Families of both Jacob and Clark sat rigid, their lives hanging on what a 3-year-old child might say. Emily's arrival was almost surreal. She entered the courthouse holding her mother's hand, her tiny feet in white shoes tapping nervously on the wooden floor. Her blonde hair was tied with a ribbon, and in her other arm she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit. She looked far too small for the cavernous courtroom, swallowed by the towering walls and polished oak benches. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she climbed into the witness chair, legs dangling, unable to reach the floor. Some people smiled at her innocence. Others frowned, convinced the prosecution was grasping at straws. The judge leaned forward, speaking gently. "Emily, do you know why you're here?" Emily shook her head, clutching her rabbit tighter. Her mother gave her an encouraging nod, but the girl's eyes darted nervously across the room. So many strangers, staring, waiting. The prosecutor knelt down to her level, voice soft. "Emily, can you tell us what you remember about the park that night?" Silence. Emily's lips parted, then closed. She stared down at her lap, too frightened to speak. The courtroom shifted uneasily. The defense smirked, whispering something to Clark. Reporters scribbled about the failed gamble. The judge adjusted his glasses, already doubting the wisdom of allowing such testimony. Seconds stretched into long, uncomfortable minutes. It seemed the experiment had failed. Emily was just a child, after all. Perhaps expecting her to carry the weight of justice was too much. But then, something shifted. The bailiff, seeing the girl's fear, quietly opened a side door. A sudden stir ran through the courtroom as heavy paws padded across the floor. Rex, the police dog who had worked during the search, entered the room. The German shepherd's coat gleamed under the lights, his calm presence instantly changing the atmosphere. Emily's eyes widened. She forgot the crowd, the lawyers, the judge. Rex! She squealed softly, sliding down from her chair. She ran toward the dog, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Rex sat obediently, tail wagging, his dark eyes steady and reassuring. The room softened. Even the judge's stern face relaxed. For the first time, Emily smiled. She pressed her cheek against Rex's fur, whispering something only he could hear. And then, to everyone's shock, she began to talk. Emily Turner was unlike any witness the Cedar Falls courthouse had ever seen. Barely 3 years old, with soft curls framing her cherubic face, she looked more like someone who belonged in a daycare than in the heavy silence of a trial that could decide the future of a man accused of destroying a town's peace. To most people, she was just a toddler far too young to understand the meaning of truth, evidence, or justice. But for the prosecution, she had become their last fragile hope. The choice to call her had not come easily. In the weeks leading up to the trial, prosecutors debated heatedly behind closed doors. Some argued it was reckless, that the defense would shred a toddler's credibility in seconds. Others said they had no choice. Without her, the case against Raymond Clark was paper-thin. Dr. Helen Morris, a child psychologist called as an expert witness, stood firm. "Children remember things differently than adults," she explained during preparations. "Traumatic events imprint themselves. Sometimes, the smallest detail can resurface in ways we don't expect. But if you push too hard, they'll shut down. She needs comfort, not pressure." That comfort, it turned out, was Rex the police dog. During preliminary meetings, Emily had barely spoken to the adults in suits. But when Rex padded into the room, she lit up, her fear melting away. She whispered secrets into his fur, describing things no one had taught her: the smell of smoke, the color of shoes, the sound of footsteps in the dark. It was enough to convince prosecutors she had something real to offer. Still, the courtroom was a different beast. As Emily sat on the witness stand that morning, clutching her stuffed rabbit, a weight of dozens of staring eyes pressed down on her. She was small, fragile, and suddenly overwhelmed. Her lips trembled. She glanced at her mother in the front row, then at the judge towering above her. She said nothing. The defense attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Victor Harlan, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. This was exactly what he had predicted. "This is a circus," he whispered to his client, Raymond Clark, who sat stiffly at the defense table. "She won't last 5 minutes." The judge gave the prosecutor a pointed look, as though silently questioning the wisdom of dragging a toddler into a murder trial. The reporters in the gallery exchanged knowing glances, their pens ready to write headlines about a prosecution gamble gone wrong. But then Rex entered the room. The German shepherd's presence shifted everything. Emily's face brightened instantly. "Rex!" she cried softly, hopping down from her chair. She buried her arms around his neck, her small body trembling less now that she had someone she trusted. The courtroom transformed in that moment. The crowd leaned forward. The tension that had suffocated the air eased slightly, as if everyone realized they weren't watching a legal trick. They were watching a child find safety in the only way she knew how. The prosecutor crouched down, lowering his voice. "Emily, can you tell Rex what you saw at the park?" Emily's tiny fingers played with Rex's ear. She whispered at first, almost too soft to hear. But then her voice grew clearer. "The man with red shoes," she said. "He scared me. He took the boy." The words struck like a lightning bolt. The gallery gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the judge froze, his gavel hovering in uncertainty. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection!" Harlan barked. "This is hearsay, unreliable, and entirely prejudicial. She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But the damage had been done. The jury had heard her. The judge raised a hand. "Sustained for now. But the witness may continue." His voice was firm, though his eyes betrayed unease. He, too, understood the gravity of what had just happened. Emily continued, oblivious to the storm around her. She tugged gently on Rex's collar as she spoke. "He had red shoes. He was by the swing. The boy cried. I was scared." Her words matched details investigators had kept out of the public record. The broken swing, the red shoes, the frightened boy. It was impossible for Emily to have invented them, unless she had truly seen it all. The defense scrambled. Harlan leaned down to his client, whispering angrily. Clark's face tightened. He rubbed his hands together nervously, though he tried to maintain composure. The jury noticed. Everyone noticed. Dr. Helen Morris was called to the stand to explain. She spoke with calm authority. Children this age often relay memories through comfort figures like a stuffed toy, or in this case Rex, the dog creates a bridge of trust. Emily is not performing. She is recalling. And the consistency of her detail is remarkable. Harlan scoffed, rising for cross-examination. "Doctor, are you suggesting this child can distinguish memory from imagination? She believes in fairy tales. Are we to convict a man based on the stories of a toddler?" Dr. Morris didn't flinch. "What she describes is not fantasy. Trauma leaves fingerprints on memory. Emily's descriptions align with physical evidence the police never shared publicly. That is not coincidence." The jury shifted in their seats, weighing her words. The defense had raised doubts, but the seed had been planted. This child, barely 3 years old, might hold the key to the entire case. Meanwhile, Emily remained with Rex, whispering into his ear as if he were the only one in the world who mattered. She didn't understand the tidal wave she had unleashed, the way her small voice now carried the weight of justice. All she knew was that Rex listened, Rex didn't scare her, and Rex never interrupted. The prosecutor closed his questioning gently, not wanting to overwhelm her. "Emily, thank you for telling Rex what you remember. That was very brave." Emily smiled faintly, still stroking the dog's fur. To her, it had simply been a conversation with a friend. To the courtroom, it was a revelation. By the time she was escorted out, whispers filled the air. Some jurors avoided looking at the defendant. Reporters scribbled faster than ever. And in the gallery, Jacob Miller's mother wept silently, clutching her husband's hand. For the first time in months, she felt hope. But for Raymond Clark, hope was slipping away. He sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with unease. The shoes. Why did she have to mention the shoes? The town of Cedar Falls had waited for answers for too long. And now, in the most unexpected way, those answers were beginning to surface, not from hardened detectives or expert witnesses, but from the soft, trembling voice of a 3-year-old child speaking to her dog. It was the moment everything began to change. The courthouse had always been a place of solemn routine, papers shuffling, gavels striking, lawyers debating in measured tones. But on that day, after Emily Turner's soft words rippled through the room, silence wrapped itself around every corner of the chamber. It was not the silence of boredom or waiting. It was the kind that hummed with unease, like the stillness before a storm breaks. The judge, Robert Ellison, leaned back in his chair. His fingers drummed against the armrest, betraying his internal conflict. In his decades on the bench, he had seen hardened criminals break down, had heard testimonies that twisted hearts and shattered alibis. But never had he presided over a case where the most pivotal words came from the lips of a 3-year-old child. The jury sat in uneasy stillness. Some leaned forward as though hanging on every syllable, while others folded their arms, skeptical of the weight being given to a toddler's recollections. Yet none could deny that something extraordinary had happened. Emily hadn't spoken to the lawyers, nor the judge, nor even the packed gallery of onlookers. She had spoken to Rex, the police dog, and what she said aligned too perfectly with hidden facts to be dismissed as coincidence. Reporters in the back row scribbled furiously. Headlines were already forming. Toddler testifies to police dog. Courtroom stunned by 3-year-old witness. Child's words shake murder trial. Outside, news vans clustered along the courthouse steps, their cameras waiting to broadcast whatever unfolded inside. The defense attorney, Victor Harlan, was the first to shatter the stillness. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor," he barked, "this is preposterous. We cannot allow this charade to continue. A 3-year-old child cannot possibly provide credible testimony. What she said was hearsay, coaxed from her by a dog of all things. This entire exercise risks poisoning the jury with emotion rather than fact." His words sliced through the tension, but Judge Ellison did not immediately respond. He studied Emily, who now sat cross-legged on the floor beside Rex, her tiny hands buried in the shepherd's thick fur. She wasn't paying attention to the uproar. She was humming softly, her stuffed rabbit tucked between her knees, as if she had already done her part, and the rest was none of her concern. The prosecutor, Sarah McIntyre, stood calmly. She had anticipated Harlan's outrage. "Your Honor," she said firmly, what the child revealed was not prompted, nor rehearsed. She recalled details that investigators had deliberately withheld from the public, the broken swing, the specific red shoes. These are facts no child could invent. Whether the defense wishes to admit it or not, the child's memory is both relevant and crucial. Harlan sneered. Crucial? She believes in fairy tales. She probably talks to her toys at night. Are we to put the fate of a man's life in the hands of someone who can't even spell her name? The gallery stirred. Some muttered angrily at his harshness. Others nodded in agreement. The town itself was divided, its emotions spilling into the courtroom like a restless tide. Judge Ellison finally raised his gavel. Crack. The sound silenced the room. "Enough," he said. His voice carried authority, but his eyes revealed the storm brewing inside him. He could not simply dismiss what had been said, nor could he easily validate it. The law was rigid, yet justice was slippery, and here they clashed in the form of a child and a dog. He leaned forward. The court will allow the child to continue, under careful supervision. The jury will be instructed to weigh her words with appropriate caution. Gasps echoed, mixed with applause quickly silenced by another strike of the gavel. Emily, still unaware of the courtroom's divisions, looked up at Rex and whispered something again. The bailiff crouched closer, straining to hear. This time she spoke louder. He smelled funny, like smoke. And his shoes. They were shiny, red. Every detective in the room stiffened. They had smelled smoke in Clark's garage, where a small pile of burned fabric had been discovered. And the shoes, those infamous shoes, had haunted the investigation. They had been mentioned in quiet circles, photographed discreetly, but never released to the press. Yet here she was, recalling them as casually as if describing a playground game. Clark shifted uneasily at the defense table. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapped rapidly against the wood. For the first time since the trial began, cracks appeared in his armor of defiance. Jurors noticed. Reporters noticed. Everyone noticed. Victor Harlan scrambled to regain control. "Your Honor," he shouted, "I demand that this line of testimony be stricken. This child is being led, whether intentionally or not. She cannot even identify my client properly. Ask her who this man with red shoes is. See if she points at my client." The challenge hung in the air like a dare. Sarah McIntyre's heart pounded. She hesitated. Was it right to ask Emily to identify Clark directly? The child was fragile, easily frightened. But if she didn't, the defense would continue to hammer doubts into the jury. She crouched near Emily, her voice tender. "Emily, sweetheart, do you see the man you talked about? The one with the red shoes?" Emily looked up, blinking her wide blue eyes. She scanned the room slowly. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat into silence again. Then, without hesitation, she lifted her tiny finger and pointed directly at Raymond Clark. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts. Someone in the gallery cried out, "It's him!" The judge's gavel thundered against the bench. "Order! Order in the court!" Clark's face went pale. He tried to hide it, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. Harlan slammed his briefcase shut in frustration, barking again about prejudice and manipulation, but his voice was drowned out by the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Emily, meanwhile, had already turned her attention back to Rex, giggling softly as the shepherd licked her cheek. To her, it was over. She had done what needed to be done, though she could never understand the magnitude of her words. The trial would not end that day, but from that moment on, the tide had shifted. Jurors whispered among themselves, their eyes no longer neutral when they glanced at the defendant. Reporters scribbled frantically, headlines growing more dramatic by the minute. The prosecution, once floundering, had been handed a lifeline from the most unlikely of sources. Yet beneath the surface of victory lay a deeper unease. The law was not built to rely on toddlers, nor to bend around whispers to a dog. And yet, everyone in that courtroom had felt the truth in Emily's words, as undeniable as the weight of a gavel striking wood. Judge Ellison rubbed his temples after dismissing the court for the day. He knew what awaited: appeals, criticism, endless scrutiny. But he also knew that sometimes justice arrived in ways no one expected. And so, as the sun dipped behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the town square, Cedar Falls braced itself. The trial was far from over, but the balance had shifted. A little girl, no more than 3 years old, had tipped the scales. And nothing would ever be the same again. The courthouse was still humming from the shock of Emily's tiny finger pointing at Raymond Clark. The jury had seen it. The press had seen it. Everyone in that chamber felt the gravity of the moment. But for Emily herself, the storm she had unleashed was invisible. She was just a child, crouched beside Rex, stroking his fur, as though the great German shepherd was her only anchor in a world of towering strangers and booming voices. Rex sat calmly, his head lowered so Emily could reach him more easily. To the adults, he was a police dog, a trained professional, used for searches, evidence recovery, and calming witnesses. To Emily, he was simply a friend, a protector, the one soul in the room who didn't ask questions, didn't glare, and didn't expect her to be braver than her age allowed. Her small hand brushed his ear as she whispered. The microphone on the witness stand barely caught her words, but the silence of the courtroom carried them. "He scared me," she said softly. "The man with red shoes. He took the boy." "I saw." The gallery gasped again. This wasn't the frightened rambling of a child. It was a direct, chilling account. The defense attorney leapt to his feet once more, shouting objections, but the judge silenced him with a stern look. Sarah McIntyre, the prosecutor, leaned forward. She didn't dare press Emily too hard. "Emily, can you tell Rex more about that night? What do you remember?" Emily nodded, though she never lifted her eyes from Rex. She began to speak not to the jury, not to the attorneys, but to the dog sitting patiently at her side. "It was dark," she said. "The swings were moving. He told the boy to be quiet. I hid behind the slide. I didn't want him to see me." Sarah's throat tightened. These were not rehearsed words. They were fragments of a memory seared into the mind of a child who had witnessed more than anyone realized. Then Emily added something that made the room go cold. "He smelled funny, like smoke. And he had shiny shoes, red. He dropped something by the sandbox. A toy." Detectives in the gallery exchanged sharp glances. They remembered the broken toy truck found near the park, covered in dirt. They had considered it random litter, but now, through Emily's words, it transformed into a possible piece of evidence tied to that night. Victor Harlan, the defense attorney, couldn't stay silent. He stormed toward the bench. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We're listening to a toddler chatter about smells and shoes as though it were sworn testimony. This child is weaving fairy tales, and the prosecution is exploiting her." Judge Ellison's gavel cracked against the bench. "Sit down, Mr. Harlan. The jury will decide what weight to give the child's words. But I will not have this courtroom turned into a shouting match." Harlan fumed, but he obeyed. His client, Raymond Clark, sat stiff and pale, his fingers digging into the armrest of his chair. For the first time, his confidence seemed shaken. Meanwhile, Emily was still speaking softly to Rex. "He looked at me," she whispered, her eyes suddenly clouding with fear. "He saw me hiding. But I ran home." She clutched Rex's fur tighter, pressing her cheek against his neck. The German shepherd stayed perfectly still, his presence grounding her. Sarah McIntyre exchanged a glance with Dr. Helen Morris, the child psychologist. Dr. Morris gave a small nod. This was exactly why Rex was in the room. The dog's calming influence allowed Emily to speak where she otherwise would have retreated into silence. Without him, none of this would be unfolding. "Emily," Sarah asked gently, "did you see where the man went after?" Emily shook her head. "He pulled the boy." The boy cried. "I was scared. I ran." Her voice quivered now, and tears welled in her eyes. Rex licked her hand, and she giggled weakly through her fear. The room softened at the sight, a child torn between terror and innocence, finding courage only because of the dog at her side. The jury was transfixed. Some leaned forward, their pens forgotten. Others simply stared at Emily, as though trying to reconcile the enormity of her words with the fragility of her presence. For the prosecution, this moment was gold. They hadn't just presented evidence. They had shown the jury raw humanity. A child, unpolished and unprompted, had revealed truths adults had failed to uncover. But for the defense, it was a nightmare. Harlan scribbled notes furiously, already planning his counterattack. He would claim Emily's memory was contaminated by police, by her parents, by media coverage. He would argue she was parroting what adults wanted her to say. But deep down, he knew the jury had seen something that no amount of cross-examination could erase: authenticity. The judge finally called for a recess. As the gavel fell, the tension broke like a snapped wire. Reporters bolted from the room, phones in hand, desperate to push the story out first. Toddler describes abduction through police dog. One headline would scream within the hour. Emily, oblivious to the chaos she had caused, skipped alongside Rex as the bailiff guided them out of the courtroom. She clutched her stuffed rabbit in one hand and Rex's fur in the other. To her, it was just another conversation with her best friend. Outside, Raymond Clark slumped in his chair. Sweat glistened on his brow. For the first time, he realized the case was no longer tilting in his favor. A child's innocence had pierced through the walls he had built, and now every juror's eyes carried doubt that could soon harden into conviction. As the court recessed, Judge Ellison lingered at the bench, his gaze heavy. He had allowed something unprecedented, something unorthodox. A toddler and a dog had just shifted the trajectory of a murder trial. He didn't know yet what the law books would say about it, but he knew one thing. He had seen truth, raw and undeniable, spill out from the smallest of voices. And so had everyone else. When court resumed, the stakes would only grow higher. Emily had cracked the surface. What lay beneath hidden details, buried evidence, suppressed memories, was about to come to light. And the man sitting at the defense table knew it. His red shoes, once an afterthought, had become the noose tightening around his neck. The town of Cedar Falls had waited months for answers. Now, thanks to a 3-year-old girl and a loyal police dog, the truth was clawing its way into the open. And the trial was only just beginning. The courthouse resumed after recess, but the air had changed. The chatter of the gallery was hushed, the reporters' pens poised like daggers, and the jury's faces taut with anticipation. Something had cracked open before the break, and everyone knew it. A child's words, whispered to a dog, had shaken the pillars of the defense. Raymond Clark sat rigid at the defendant's table, his lawyer Victor Harlan whispering furiously in his ear. Clark didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the table, jaw locked, fingers twitching. The calm he had once carried, the smug certainty that evidence would crumble and witnesses would falter, was gone. At the prosecution's table, Sarah McIntyre shuffled her notes with deliberate calm, but her heart raced. She knew what had happened during Emily's testimony wasn't just powerful, it was dangerous. If the jury believed every word of a 3-year-old, they would hand her a victory. But if they doubted Emily's memory, the defense would tear the case apart. Sarah needed something more. Something concrete to stitch Emily's fragile words into the fabric of hard evidence. And then, Emily gave it to them. The bailiff led the little girl and Rex back into the courtroom. She looked smaller than ever, holding her stuffed rabbit, her other hand resting on Rex's back. The German shepherd's steady presence made her braver than any lawyer or judge in the room. Judge Ellison leaned forward. "Emily," he said gently, "you've been very brave today. Do you remember anything else you'd like to tell us?" Emily looked at Rex, as though asking his permission. Then she crouched beside him, stroking his neck. The microphone caught her small voice again. "He dropped something," she said. The room leaned in. "What did he drop, Emily?" Sarah asked carefully, her tone feather-light. Emily's brow furrowed as she recalled. It was shiny. Not a toy. It made a clink, I think. I think it was a key. It fell near the sandbox. I saw it when I ran. Detectives in the gallery stiffened. They had combed the park dozens of times, catalogued every scrap of litter and every stone. A key had not been logged. Had they missed it? Or had someone retrieved it before investigators arrived. Emily continued, her words soft but clear. It had a picture on it. A bird. Like wings. She made a little fluttering motion with her hands. He picked it up real fast. He didn't want me to see. But I saw. Gasps spread through the room. A specific image engraved wings on a key. This wasn't a toddler's invention. This was detail. This was memory. Clark's head jerked up, his face blanching. For the first time, his composure cracked. Sarah seized the moment. Emily, are you sure about that? A key with a bird on it? Emily nodded earnestly, looking at Rex. Yes, wings. The jury's eyes darted toward Clark. They hadn't seen the evidence yet, but his reaction told them everything. His sudden stiffness, the nervous swallow, the way his hand trembled as it gripped the armrest. It was as if Emily's words had unlocked something he desperately wanted hidden. Victor Harlan leapt to his feet again, objecting furiously. Your Honor, this is absurd. A child is inventing stories about keys and birds, and the prosecution is feeding it to the jury as gospel. There is no key in evidence, no key at all. Judge Ellison raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Harlan. The child's testimony stands. Whether or not corroboration exists is for the investigation to determine. Detective Ruiz, seated in the gallery, was already scribbling notes. He remembered Clark's apartment. The locks, the odd engraved keys Clark had carried on a chain. At the time, they hadn't connected them to the park. But now it mattered. Emily tugged on Rex's ear and whispered, almost to herself. He put it in his pocket. He looked around. He was scared. Her voice broke slightly, and tears welled up again. Rex pressed closer, licking her hand. The child giggled softly, the sound piercing the heavy courtroom silence like a bell. For a moment, everyone remembered she was only 3. But her words hung in the air, undeniable. A shiny key. A bird with wings. A detail too sharp, too odd, too specific to be imagined. Sarah turned to the jury, her voice measured but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard her. A 3-year-old girl with no knowledge of police files just described an object directly tied to the defendant. That is not coincidence. That is not imagination. That is memory. Harlan slammed his pen against the table, whispering sharply into Clark's ear. But Clark didn't respond. He couldn't. The mask was gone, replaced by beads of sweat and eyes that refused to meet the jury's gaze. Judge Ellison finally called for a short break, his gavel echoing like thunder. This court will recess for 30 minutes. The gallery erupted. Reporters scrambled, phones buzzing, headlines already forming. Toddler describes key in kidnapping trial defendant shaken. In the hallway, Sarah McIntyre pulled Detective Ruiz aside. Find it, she whispered. Find that key. Search his apartment, his car, his pockets, I don't care. We need it before closing arguments. Ruiz nodded. He was already on his phone, barking orders. Meanwhile, in a quiet chamber, Emily sat on the floor beside Rex, playing with her stuffed rabbit. She hummed softly, oblivious to the firestorm she had just lit. For her, the key was just a picture in her memory. For the prosecution, it was the missing link. For Raymond Clark, it was the chain dragging him toward conviction. As the jury returned, the tension doubled. The trial was no longer a battle of testimonies. It was a hunt for truth, sparked by the smallest of witnesses. And everyone knew the hidden detail might just be the weapon that would decide the fate of a man accused of the most heinous of crimes. Raymond Clark's red shoes had drawn suspicion, but Emily's memory of the key, the bird with wings, was the nail that threatened to seal his coffin. The trial had shifted again, and this time there was no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with a tension that no recess could ease. The jury returned, faces tight with anticipation, their pens ready, though most new words could hardly capture what they had witnessed. Emily's testimony, spoken in whispers to Rex, had left a mark far deeper than anyone expected. But the defense wasn't ready to surrender. Victor Harlan paced like a caged wolf at the defense table, his papers scattered, his tie loosened. His strategy was clear: dismantle the child's credibility. If he could convince the jury that Emily's words were no more than a toddler's fantasy, then the image of the red shoes and the mysterious key would collapse like sandcastles under a wave. Judge Ellison called the court to order. His voice was firm, but carried an undercurrent of caution. He knew this next phase would be delicate. The eyes of the nation were now on this trial. Mishandling a child witness could turn public opinion as swiftly as the stroke of a gavel. "Mr. Harlan," the judge said, "you may proceed with cross-examination." Harlan rose, smoothing his jacket. He forced a smile as he approached the witness stand, though his eyes burned with calculation. Emily sat perched on the chair, Rex at her side, one hand tangled in the dog's fur. Her stuffed rabbit rested in her lap, its button eye loose from too much love. "Hello, Emily," Harlan said in a sing-song tone that barely disguised his impatience. "You've been very brave today, haven't you?" Emily said nothing. She looked down at Rex, who gave a soft whine, nudging her hand. Harlan pressed on. "Now, Emily, do you like stories?" She nodded shyly. "Of course you do. All children do." He turned to the jury with a knowing smile. "But sometimes stories and real life get a little mixed up, don't they? Like when you have a dream, and then you think it really happened." Objection came swiftly. Sarah McIntyre was on her feet. "Your Honor, the defense is leading and belittling the witness." "Sustained," Judge Ellison said. "Mr. Harlan, ask proper questions." Harlan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Emily, do you remember talking to the nice police officers before today?" "Yes," she whispered. "And did they ask you a lot of questions about that night?" "Yes." "And did your mommy and daddy talk to you about what happened too?" Emily's eyes darted nervously. She looked at Rex again before answering. "Sometimes," Harlan pounced. "So maybe when you told us about the man and the key, that was something you heard from mommy or daddy, wasn't it? Not something you really saw." Emily shook her head firmly, clutching Rex tighter. "No, I saw." Harlan leaned in, his voice sharp. "But Emily, how could you see a shiny key in the dark? How could a 3-year-old possibly remember something like that?" Emily's lips trembled. She buried her face in Rex's neck, refusing to answer. The dog stayed perfectly calm, a silent fortress between her and the world. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned at Harlan's aggressive tone. He was trying to chip away at the child's credibility, but it came across as bullying. Dr. Helen Morris, the child psychologist, leaned toward Sarah at the prosecution's table and whispered, "This could backfire on him." Judge Ellison finally intervened. "Mr. Harlan, approach with caution. This is a 3-year-old child, not a hostile witness." Harlan clenched his jaw, but he tried again, softening his tone. "Emily, did you see the news about this case?" "No," she said quietly. "Did mommy or daddy tell you that Raymond wears red shoes?" Emily shook her head. "I saw." She pointed toward Clark without hesitation. "Him," the gallery gasped. Even the reporters, who had typed endlessly through earlier testimony, stopped mid-word. The child's unwavering finger, small and trembling, pointed directly at the accused again. Clark's face darkened, his lips pressed into a thin line. Harlan tried to recover. "Emily, people make mistakes, don't they? Maybe you saw someone else? Maybe it wasn't this man?" But before Emily could falter, Rex shifted, nudging her hand with his wet nose. The little girl straightened, her fear dissolving just enough for her voice to emerge. It was him. I remember his shoes. Red. It was the kind of statement no legal training could prepare for. Raw, unfiltered truth. Harlan's shoulders slumped. He muttered something under his breath and returned to the defense table, defeated for now. His attempt to break the child had only made her resolve clearer. The jury had witnessed not confusion, but determination, bolstered by the silent strength of a dog. When it was Sarah's turn to redirect, she kept her questions simple. Emily, did anyone tell you what to say today? No. Did anyone show you a key with wings? No. Then how do you know about it? Emily rested her head against Rex's back, her small voice steady. Because I saw it. He dropped it. He picked it up. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than any expert witness ever could. Sarah stepped back, letting silence linger in the courtroom. She didn't need to add drama. Emily had spoken, and her truth hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. After the witness was excused, Dr. Morris took the stand. Her testimony was calm and clinical. She explained how children, while sometimes limited in expression, often remember trauma in fragments of intense clarity. Smells, colors, specific images, these stick in their minds long after other details fade. Emily's reference to red shoes and a key with wings is consistent with a child recalling something vividly seen in a moment of fear, Dr. Morris said. There is no evidence of coaching. In fact, her ability to recall without adult prompting is remarkable. And importantly, without Rex, she may not have spoken at all. The jury scribbled furiously. Sarah smiled faintly. This was the bridge she needed, the connection between Emily's fragile words and psychological validation. Meanwhile, Detective Ruiz slipped out of the courtroom, his phone pressed to his ear. He had dispatched officers to Clark's apartment. They were searching every drawer, every pocket, every lock for a key with wings. If they found it, Emily's words would transform from testimony to proof. Back inside, the weight of the day pressed on everyone. For the jury, the child's bravery was unforgettable. For the defense, the silence after their failed cross-examination was devastating. For Raymond Clark, the walls were closing in. And for Emily, sitting quietly in the hallway with Rex, the trial was just a scary place with too many eyes. She didn't know she had broken the silence that bound an entire case. She only knew that Rex had listened, and that somehow, because of him, the grown-ups were finally listening too. The truth, once buried, had begun to claw its way into the open. And nothing, not even the sharpest lawyer's words, could shove it back into the dark. The sun was already beginning to set outside the courthouse windows, streaking the sky with amber and violet, when the jury was called back after another tense recess. The trial had dragged into the late afternoon, but no one complained. Not the jurors, not the weary reporters, not even the restless townspeople who had filled every available seat. They all knew something was about to break. Detective Ruiz had returned, his expression tight, his jacket rumpled from hours in the field. He walked directly to the prosecution's table and bent low, whispering into Sarah McIntyre's ear. Her eyes widened just slightly before she schooled her expression into calm neutrality. They had found something. Sarah rose as Judge Ellison called the court to order. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was an undercurrent of quiet triumph. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce newly discovered evidence located only this afternoon, as a result of testimony provided by the child witness. The defense shot to its feet instantly. Objection. This is a trial, not a scavenger hunt. We can't have police bringing in surprise evidence halfway through. Judge Ellison adjusted his glasses, staring over them at Sarah. Ms. McIntyre, is this evidence material? Sarah nodded. Very much so, Your Honor. It directly corroborates the child's statements under oath. The judge sighed heavily. Bring it forward. Detective Ruiz strode to the witness stand, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside was a single key, small, silver, and engraved with the image of outstretched wings. The courtroom gasped as though the air itself had been sucked out. Sarah lifted the bag for the jury to see. Ladies and gentlemen, this key was found inside the pocket lining of a jacket belonging to the defendant, Raymond Clark. It was hidden, but not well enough. The engraving, as you can see, matches the description given earlier today by the witness Emily. A description she could not have invented, as she has never been inside Mr. Clark's apartment nor seen his belongings. The jury leaned forward, eyes fixed on the tiny object glinting under the lights. It was tangible, undeniable, physical proof linking Clark to the story of a 3-year-old child. Victor Harlan scrambled to object again. This proves nothing. A key is just a key, millions of them exist. The girl's words were vague, easily suggestible. This is a coincidence, nothing more. But even as he ranted, Clark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sweat rolled down his temple. The jurors saw it. The reporters scribbled it. The weight of the key pressed like a stone against his entire defense. Sarah called Detective Ruiz to testify. He explained where the key had been found and that Clark's neighbors had confirmed seeing him wear the jacket multiple times. Ruiz also detailed how the design was not common, but part of a custom locksmith shop that made only a limited number of such keys for high-security locks. The jury took notes feverishly. Next, Sarah called forensic analyst Dana Fields. She explained that trace soil on the key's ridges matched soil from the town park where the boy had vanished, the same park Emily had described. At that moment, a ripple ran through the courtroom. It wasn't just the child's memory anymore. It was science. It was evidence. Clark's hands fidgeted on the table. His breathing grew heavier, audible even in the hushed room. Then came the witnesses. The prosecution recalled an older man named Henry Cole, the park's night janitor. He had been hesitant before, his memory clouded by fear of retaliation. But now, after hearing Emily's brave words and seeing the key, he found new resolve. "I saw him," Henry said, pointing directly at Clark, "late that night. He was near the sandbox, fumbling around like he'd dropped something. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to get involved. Now I wish I'd spoken sooner." The jury's eyes locked on Clark again. Another piece sliding into place. Sarah's final move was subtle, but devastating. She brought in a shoebox from evidence storage. Inside was a pair of sneakers bright red, scuffed along the soles. "These," she said, "were taken from Mr. Clark's apartment during the initial search. At the time, they seemed unremarkable. But thanks to Emily's testimony, we understand their significance. The child didn't know what brand or style to describe. She just remembered red shoes. And here they are." The jury's faces hardened. Pieces that had once seemed scattered now clicked into a chilling picture. Clark at the park. Clark losing a key. Clark wearing red shoes while dragging a boy into the night. The defense tried to fight back. Harlan argued that the shoes could belong to anyone, that the key was circumstantial, that the child's memory was unreliable. But the words rang hollow now. They had once carried weight, but the evidence was stacking too high, too fast, too precisely. Clark himself began to unravel. During a tense moment when Sarah replayed testimony, he muttered audibly, "This is ridiculous. She's just a kid. She doesn't know anything." The jury heard it. They saw the twitch in his jaw, the desperation leaking from his voice. The calm, smug man who had entered this trial was gone, replaced by a cornered figure watching his lies collapse. Emily, meanwhile, sat quietly with Rex in the back of the courtroom, no longer on the stand. She swung her little legs, whispering nonsense to the dog. unaware that her small voice had cracked open the case wide enough for adults to finally see. When court adjourned for the day, the gallery exploded with chatter. Headlines were already forming. Key with wings found in Clark's jacket forensics. Tie it to park soil. But inside the hearts of the jurors, something deeper stirred. They had entered this trial skeptical of a toddler's memory. Now they had seen those memories transform into fingerprints of truth keys, shoes, soil, and witness testimony that aligned with frightening precision. For Clark, the turning point had arrived. No clever defense could erase the image of a child pointing, the gleam of red shoes, or the tiny engraved wings on a hidden key. Justice was no longer a question of if. It was only a matter of when. And as the courthouse emptied into the night, one thing was certain. A 3-year-old girl and a loyal police dog had turned the tide of a trial that once seemed destined for doubt. The courthouse was packed for the final day of trial. A low hum filled the chamber as townsfolk, reporters, and families leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the verdict that would decide whether justice had finally arrived. For months, Cedar Falls had lived in the shadow of fear and suspicion. Parents had walked their children home from school with uneasy glances. Neighbors had whispered behind closed doors about guilt, about innocence, about whether the justice system would fail them. But now, the end was here. Raymond Clark sat stiffly at the defense table, his once confident posture shattered. Dark circles hollowed his eyes, his suit rumpled from nights spent sleepless. He no longer looked like a man in control. He looked like a man waiting for the axe to fall. Victor Harlan, his defense attorney, had fought tooth and nail, but the fight had bled him dry. His closing arguments had been desperate, insisting coincidences, flawed memories, and unreliable psychology. But the jury had watched Clark sweat under the weight of evidence. The red shoes, the winged key, the soil match, the janitor's testimony. Piece by piece, a puzzle had formed, and Clark's image sat right in the center. At the prosecution's table, Sarah McIntyre sat calm but tight-lipped, her hands clasped. She knew she had done her part. She had given the jury everything they needed, facts, testimony, and the voice of a 3-year-old girl who had cut through the noise with simple truth. Emily wasn't in the courtroom this time. After her testimony, Judge Ellison had excused her from further appearances. She was at home with her parents, coloring in her bedroom, Rex lying beside her, his head resting on her lap. She didn't understand that her words had become the linchpin of a historic case. To her, the trial was just a scary building with too many eyes. To everyone else, she had become the child who spoke when no one else could. The jury filed back into the courtroom, solemn and pale. 12 people, bound by duty, carrying the weight of an entire town's hope. Every step echoed like thunder in the hushed chamber. Judge Ellison cleared his throat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in hand. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of the moment. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff carried the paper to the judge. Ellison opened it, read silently, then returned it with a nod. Please read the verdict aloud. The foreman unfolded the slip again. The room leaned in. In the matter of the state versus Raymond Clark, on the charge of kidnapping and murder of Michael Harris. He paused, his throat tightening. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The chamber erupted. Gasps, cries, and shouts burst through the air. Reporters scrambled, pens flying, cameras snapping. Families clutched one another. Mothers wept openly. Even strangers hugged, relief surging through them like a wave. At the defense table, Clark's body sagged as though the words had broken his bones. His mouth opened, but no sound came. For months, he had denied, deflected, hidden behind legal shields. But the shields were gone. His secrets had been dragged into the light by the smallest of witnesses. Harlan slammed a hand on the table, already shouting about appeals, but his words were drowned in the noise. Clark's fate had been sealed. Judge Ellison's gavel hammered down. Order in the court. Order. Slowly, the uproar dimmed. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. This court thanks the jury for its service. Justice has spoken. Sentencing will follow, but for today, this trial is concluded. His eyes lingered on the prosecution table. Let it be remembered that sometimes justice comes from the smallest voices. Let it be remembered that truth is not measured in age, but in courage. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with townsfolk. News vans crowded the street, their lights blazing as anchors delivered the story live. Verdict reached in Cedar Falls. Case defendant found guilty. After testimony from 3-year-old girl, the town that had been fractured by fear now breathed as one. Parents hugged their children tighter. Neighbors who had doubted one another clasped hands. And across the state, the story spread like wildfire, a symbol of hope in a world too often shadowed by doubt. At home, Emily sat cross-legged on the carpet, her crayons scattered around her. Rex snored softly beside her. The phone rang in the kitchen. Her mother answered, tears of relief in her voice as she heard the words. It's over. He's guilty. Emily looked up curiously. Mommy, can Rex come to the park with me tomorrow? Her mother knelt, hugging her tight, her voice trembling. Yes, baby. Yes, he can. Emily didn't understand the enormity of what she had done. She didn't know that her whispers to Rex had carried more weight than entire binders of legal arguments. She didn't know that her courage had inspired a community to step forward, to believe, to fight. She only knew that she had told the truth and that Rex had listened. Weeks later, Judge Ellison would speak at a press conference. His words would be printed in newspapers across the country. This case reminds us that justice is not always found in grand speeches or complex evidence. Sometimes it is found in the unguarded honesty of a child. Sometimes it is a dog who opens the door for truth to step through. And sometimes it is a community's willingness to listen. For Cedar Falls, the trial became a story retold in schools, churches, and town halls. A story not just of crime and punishment, but of bravery. Of how a 3-year-old girl, too small to even reach the witness stand without help, had stood taller than anyone else in the courtroom. Emily grew up never fully grasping the way her words had changed lives. But for the people of Cedar Falls, and for every person who read the headlines, she remained the symbol of something rare. Proof that innocence can carry a power strong enough to topple lies. That even the smallest voice can echo loud enough to shake the walls of a courtroom. And so, in a town once shadowed by fear, hope bloomed again. Justice had been served, and it had come not from the mighty or the powerful, but from a child who had pointed at a dog in court and whispered the truth. Cedar Falls would never forget.